The night sky above Germany was burning. Searchlights clawed through the blackness as flak shells burst like malignant fireworks around a formation of British bombers. Among them flew a Lancaster named S for Sugar, its engines roaring against the cold wind, its belly packed with bombs destined for Berlin. In the tail turret sat Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade, just 21 years old, gripping the handles of his twin Browning .303, eyes sweeping the darkness for a glimpse of movement. A streak, a flash, a predator. He had been through raids before, but something about this night felt different. The sky was alive with death. The Germans had learned how to triangulate the bombers, and the flak came so thick it looked like the air itself was on fire. "Keep her steady," came the pilot's voice through the intercom, calm but tight. Nicholas didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his stomach knotted. He watched tracer rounds arc past the turret glass, orange lines slicing the air like scythes. Then he saw it, a shadow sliding in from below. A Ju-88 night fighter, its engines a low growl beneath the wind. "Fighter below!" Nicholas shouted, squeezing the triggers. His guns barked, the barrels glowing red in the cold. The fighter rolled, answering with a burst that slammed into the Lancaster's fuselage. The plane jolted violently. "We've been hit!" someone yelled. The right wing caught fire, spreading fast. The crew scrambled to control the aircraft as flames raced along the wing and smoke filled the cabin. "Prepare to bail out!" The order came sharp through the intercom. Nicholas turned to grab his parachute, but it was gone. A burst of cannon fire had torn through the fuselage and ripped it clean away. His heart froze. Every man on the Lancaster had a chance to jump, except him. The bomber shuddered again, tilting into a slow, fiery spin. Heat licked the turret glass, and the world outside was a blur of orange and black. Nicholas coughed as the smoke thickened. The intercom was filled with chaos, men shouting, static, then silence. He tried to reach the escape hatch, but the fire cut him off. His gloves began to smoke. His lungs screamed. The thought hit him like a bullet. This is it. He was trapped, burning alive, 20,000 feet above Germany. He smashed at the turret canopy, desperate for air. Below him, the countryside flickered with anti-aircraft bursts, small flashes miles beneath his feet. And then, amid the noise and the fire, a single thought rose above the panic. Cold, clear, impossible. Better to fall than to burn. It was madness, but it was all he had left. He kicked open the turret door, heat searing his face. The wind howled in, sucking the flames backward. He took one final breath of smoke, turned his back to the fire, and hurled himself into the night. For a second, there was nothing but silence. No sound, no sky, just the infinite pull of gravity. Nicholas Alkemade was falling, 20,000 feet with no parachute into the frozen darkness of Nazi Germany. The rush of air was deafening. The wind tore at his face, ripped the goggles from his head, and flattened his uniform against his body. For a few endless seconds, Nicholas Alkemade couldn't even understand what was happening. Only the feel of speed, the pull of gravity, and the strange calm that followed once the burning light of the Lancaster disappeared above him. He was falling, tumbling through the black German night, the stars spinning in dizzy circles overhead. There was no time to think, no time to scream. The air was freezing at that altitude, biting his skin until it went numb. He spread his arms and legs instinctively, trying to stabilize, like he'd once seen parachutists do during training, but there was no parachute, no safety, just the endless dark and the thought, almost serene, this is how it ends. Below him, the glow of fires flickered faintly on the ground, the result of bombing runs, of other crews who had hit their marks and now turned for home. He wasn't going home. He wondered if anyone would even know what happened. Would his mother receive a telegram? Would they ever find what was left of him? The air tore tears from his eyes before he could wipe them away. He fell for what felt like forever. Seconds stretched into minutes, his mind alternating between panic and a strange detachment. He remembered the heat in the turret, the crack of gunfire, the captain's voice shouting over the intercom. And then, unexpectedly, something shifted inside him. The fear began to fade. The noise of the wind became distant. For a moment, it was quiet again, peaceful even. The stars above were sharp and bright, and the earth below seemed to rise to meet him, slow and soft, like a wave. Then the wind changed. The smoke from his burning plane drifted past, and the air filled with the faint smell of pine. He could see the ground now, a blur of dark forest and white snow. He braced himself, though he didn't know what for. He'd heard stories of people falling into snowdrifts and surviving from great heights, but that was fantasy. Nobody fell 4 miles and lived. Nobody. He thought of his crew, the ones who'd jumped, and hoped at least some of them had made it. He thought of his fiancée, Eileen, and wished he'd written her one more letter. He thought of home, the quiet English countryside, the sound of rain against his window. And then all thought vanished as the darkness rushed up to meet him. The impact came like thunder. Pain exploded through his body, then vanished just as quickly. He didn't feel broken bones or fire, just the crushing weight of snow and branches collapsing around him. The world tilted, then went black. When Nicholas opened his eyes, he was lying on his back, staring at the night sky through a tangle of pine branches. He couldn't move. The smell of pine needles and cold earth filled his lungs. His legs burned, his side ached, but he was breathing. He was alive. It didn't make sense. He looked around, slowly. His fall had been broken by a cluster of fir trees that had bent under his weight, their thick branches slowing him down before dumping him into a deep drift of snow below. His uniform was torn, his face bleeding, but he was in one piece. He laughed, or maybe cried. He couldn't tell which. "I'm alive," he whispered into the cold. "Bloody hell. I'm alive." In the distance, he could hear the faint crack of gunfire and the distant rumble of engines. Germany was still at war, and Nicholas Alkemade, the man who had fallen 20,000 feet without a parachute, was lying behind enemy lines, alive but alone. The world was eerily silent. The roar of engines, the scream of flak, all gone. Only the faint whisper of wind through the trees and the soft creak of snow shifting beneath him. Nicholas Alkemade lay there for several minutes, staring up at the fractured canopy above, still unable to believe that he was breathing. His back ached, his leg throbbed, and the cold was starting to seep in through his torn uniform. But he was alive. That single thought echoed in his mind again and again, as if saying it enough times might make it real. He sat up slowly, wincing at the pain that shot through his left knee. His right arm felt heavy and bruised, but not broken. He checked himself in disbelief. A few cuts, a twisted ankle, burns on his hands from the fire in the turret. Nothing more. No broken bones, no internal bleeding. He should have been dead 100 times over. As his eyes adjusted, the world around him came into focus. Dense pine forest, moonlight glinting off snow, and the distant glow of fires on the horizon. Somewhere out there, his Lancaster had crashed. Somewhere, German troops would be searching for parachutes, for survivors, for proof of another downed bomber. He couldn't stay here. He pulled himself to his feet, leaning on a nearby branch for support. His parachute harness was gone, burned, shredded, or still in the wreck. He had nothing but his pistol, a small first aid kit, and a few rations in his flight suit. The temperature was well below freezing. Every breath turned to mist. He started walking, limping through the snow, leaving a broken trail of footprints behind him. The forest was vast, silent except for the occasional crack of ice-laden branches giving way. Every sound made him freeze, listening for the crunch of boots or the bark of a dog. The Germans patrolled these woods. He knew that. After an hour of trudging, exhaustion hit him like a wall. His body was running on shock and adrenaline. He found a hollow under a fallen tree, cleared enough snow to lie down, and wrapped his arms around himself for warmth. His eyelids grew heavy. He dreamed of home, of tea by the fire, of laughter, of Eileen smiling at him in the sun. When he woke, daylight was breaking through the trees. The cold had stiffened his joints, and his breath fogged in the pale morning air. He stood, his legs trembling, and kept moving. He had no map, no bearings, just the instinct to head west toward Allied lines. Somewhere across hundreds of miles of enemy territory lay freedom. But before he had gone far, he saw something that froze him in place. Footprints, not his own, fresh ones, heavy boots moving between the trees ahead. He dropped into the snow, heart pounding. Voices followed, sharp, guttural, unmistakably German. Soldiers. He pressed himself against the ground, his pulse hammering in his ears. The voices grew louder, then passed within meters of him. He could see their helmets through the branches, the glint of rifles slung over their shoulders. They were searching, likely for the wreckage, maybe for survivors. For him. He waited until the voices faded into the distance, then slowly rose, every muscle trembling. He couldn't outrun them, not in his condition. He needed shelter, somewhere to hide until nightfall. Then he'd move again. By afternoon, he spotted a faint column of smoke rising in the distance. A village. Risky, but he had no choice. He followed it cautiously, every step measured, until he saw the outlines of cottages between the trees. And that's when he saw her, an elderly woman, wrapped in a thick shawl, standing outside her door with a bucket of water. She looked up and saw him, a young man in a burned RAF uniform, limping, pale, half-frozen. Their eyes met. Nicholas froze, not knowing whether she would scream or help him. The woman hesitated for a heartbeat, then motioned him forward quickly, fear in her eyes. "Schnell," she whispered. "Come." Before they see. For the second time in 24 hours, Nicholas Alkemade's life was spared. This time by a German civilian who should have turned him in. The woman's cottage was small and old, its timber frame half buried in snow and smoke curling from a narrow brick chimney. She hurried Nicholas inside before he could say a word, glancing over her shoulder with the tension of someone used to fear. The door shut with a soft thud, and suddenly the world was warm again, the scent of wood smoke, baking bread, and something faintly sweet filling the air. Nicholas stood there shivering, dripping snow onto the wooden floorboards. The woman, her face lined, eyes pale and alert, pointed toward the hearth. "Sit," she whispered in broken English. "Quick!" He sank onto a small stool near the fire, the heat biting at his frozen hands. Every muscle in his body screamed, but it was the warmth that nearly undid him. He could have cried with relief. The woman poured him a cup of something hot, strong, bitter coffee, and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. For a moment there were no words, only the crackle of fire and the ticking of a clock on the wall. Then she asked quietly, "Englander?" He nodded. "RAF. My plane. Shot down." Her mouth tightened. "Here. Dangerous. Soldiers come. Always." She pointed to the window, her voice barely audible. "You hide." He wanted to protest, to thank her, to explain, but she was already moving, pulling aside a rug and lifting a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a shallow space lined with straw and old blankets. "Go," she said. "Now." He hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" She met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "Because my son, dead, Russian front. War kills all sons." Then she pushed him toward the hole. "Go!" Nicholas climbed down, curling himself into the dark, narrow space. The board slid back into place, cutting off the light. He could hear her footsteps above, the scrape of the rug, the faint creak of the door opening again. Moments later came the sound of boots, heavy, methodical, unmistakable. German voices followed, sharp and commanding. His heart began to hammer in his chest. He could make out fragments of conversation. "Lancaster, abgestürzt, englische Fallschirm, suchen." They were looking for him. He held his breath as the footsteps came closer. One of the soldiers knocked something over, a pot maybe, and the woman gasped softly. They were searching her home. Nicholas could hear every sound: boots on the floor, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of a rifle butt against the table. He pressed his face against the cold earth, willing himself not to move, not even to breathe. The voices grew louder, then stopped directly above him. He could hear the muffled conversation, a man's voice demanding answers, the woman replying in fast, nervous German. He caught one word: allein, alone. There was silence. Then a laugh. The soldier said something mocking, something about the smell of English smoke. A match struck. For a terrible second, Nicholas thought they were going to burn the place. But instead, the smell of tobacco drifted down through the cracks. The man was lighting a cigarette. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boots moved toward the door. The hinges creaked, voices faded into the distance. The woman waited another full minute before lifting the floorboard. Nicholas blinked in the sudden light. Her hands were trembling. "They come again soon," she whispered. "You must go, tonight." He climbed out, his legs weak, his breath shaking. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You saved my life." She nodded, avoiding his eyes. "War makes us all sinners and saints," she said softly. Then she handed him a small loaf of bread and pointed west. "Go when dark. Forest first, then river. Find the partisans." He didn't know if he could make it, not on foot, not wounded. But he also knew she was right. If he stayed, he'd doom her too. That night, beneath the cover of trees and moonlight, Nicholas Alkemade slipped out of the village and vanished once more into the frozen German forest. A man who had already cheated death once, now hunted by those who refused to believe he could still be alive. The forest was a maze of black trees and moonlit snow. Nicholas Alkemade moved like a ghost, guided only by instinct and the faint pull of survival. Each breath stung his throat. His burns ached with every step, and the bitter cold clawed at his exposed skin. He had no compass, no map, only the vague direction the woman had whispered, west toward the river. For hours he stumbled through the woods, following the faint sound of running water until he reached a narrow stream frozen at the edges. He crouched beside it, drinking from a hole in the ice, when the snap of a branch froze him in place. He looked up sharply. Between the trees, a figure stood, rifle raised. "Don't move," a voice hissed in accented English. Nicholas froze, his mind racing. The man stepped into view, scruffy, wearing a heavy coat patched in places, a red armband tied around his arm. He wasn't a German soldier, he was a partisan. The man eyed Nicholas carefully, his finger still on the trigger. "Who are you?" "Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade," he said hoarsely. "Royal Air Force. My plane shot down." The partisan didn't lower his rifle right away. "Where's your parachute?" Nicholas almost laughed. "That's a long story." After a tense silence, the man lowered his weapon. "Come," he said, jerking his head toward the trees. "You're lucky. We were looking for survivors." They led him through the forest to a hidden camp, a collection of rough shelters half buried in snow, camouflaged under pine branches. A fire burned low at the center, and a few men turned as they entered, their faces wary and tired. One of them, older, with a thick beard and a commanding presence, stood and approached. "This is the Englishman," the younger partisan said. "He says his plane was shot down." The older man studied him in silence, his eyes narrowing. "You look half dead," he said in halting English. "Sit, eat." Nicholas collapsed beside the fire, warmth seeping back into his frozen limbs. Someone handed him a bowl of soup. He ate in silence, then told them everything: the attack, the flames, the missing parachute, the jump. As he spoke, their faces changed from skepticism to disbelief. "You jumped without a parachute?" the bearded man repeated slowly. Nicholas nodded. "I didn't have a choice. I should be dead, but I landed in the trees, and snow broke my fall." There was a long pause. Then the older man laughed, a deep, incredulous laugh that echoed through the camp. "You fell from the sky like a bird and lived?" God must have been drinking that night. Even the others chuckled, but behind their laughter was respect and a kind of awe. They offered him a place by the fire and a coat to replace his burned one. Over the next few days, Nicholas helped where he could, chopping wood, tending fires, listening to their stories. He learned that the group was made up of forced laborers, escaped prisoners, and German deserters who had turned against the regime. They sabotaged train lines, ambushed convoys, and guided downed Allied airmen toward safety. For the first time since his fall, Nicholas felt something like belonging. These men lived on the edge of death every day, just as he had. Only their war was on the ground. One night, the older partisan handed him a map drawn on rough paper. "There," he said, pointing to a small town near the Ruhr. "British lines beyond the river. Dangerous, but possible. When the weather clears, we'll get you there." Nicholas looked at the crude markings, then at the man. "Why help me?" he asked quietly. The partisan shrugged. "Because you're proof," he said. "Proof that even death can lose." Nicholas didn't know what to say. He only nodded, staring into the flames, the sound of wind outside mingling with distant artillery. He had fallen from 20,000 feet and lived. Maybe now, just maybe, he could make it home. But fate wasn't finished with him yet, because before he could reach Allied lines, the Germans would find the camp. The morning it happened, the forest was too quiet. Nicholas woke to the muffled sound of boots crunching in snow, not the cautious steps of partisans, but the heavy, synchronized rhythm of trained soldiers. His stomach dropped. Before he could move, shouts erupted outside the camp. "Raus! Hände hoch!" Gunfire cracked through the air. The men around him scrambled for their weapons, but the Germans were already upon them, dozens of them fanning out through the trees, rifles raised. Smoke filled the air as the partisans tried to flee into the forest, but the ambush was complete. Nicholas ducked behind a log, bullets shredding the bark above his head. A grenade exploded nearby, throwing him into the snow. His ears rang. When he lifted his head again, 2 German soldiers were standing over him, shouting orders. He raised his hands slowly. His body still ached from the fall days earlier. There would be no running now. They dragged him to his feet and searched him roughly, stripping away his coat and weapons. When they found his RAF insignia under the layers of burned fabric, the officer in charge frowned, clearly confused. "Ein Engländer?" he muttered. "From the sky?" Nicholas said nothing. They shoved him toward a truck at the forest's edge where the surviving partisans, maybe 5 of them, were already bound and beaten. As the engine roared to life, Nicholas stared out at the smoking camp, the fire swallowing the place that had saved him. Hours later, they reached a small command post, little more than a farmhouse turned Gestapo outpost. The prisoners were herded inside. Nicholas was pulled apart from the others and shoved into a cold room with a single desk, where an officer sat waiting. The man's uniform was immaculate, his eyes sharp and cold. "So," the officer began in fluent English, "you are an airman?" Nicholas nodded wearily. "Royal Air Force. And where is your parachute?" He hesitated. "I didn't have one." The officer smiled thinly, as though indulging a joke. "You expect me to believe that you fell from your plane, from 20,000 feet, without a parachute, and lived?" Nicholas met his gaze steadily. "That's exactly what happened." The officer leaned back, studying him. "Lies," he said finally. "You are a spy. No pilot survives such a fall." "I'm not a spy," Nicholas said calmly. "Check the wreckage." "My plane was hit near Berlin, Lancaster, serial number ND467. My crew bailed out. I fell, and the trees and snow saved me. Believe what you like, but that's the truth." The Gestapo officer stood, pacing slowly behind him. "You claim to fall 4 miles and live, yet here you sit, barely scratched. You should be pulp." Nicholas didn't answer. There was nothing left to prove. Days passed. He was interrogated again and again. They checked his story, his unit, the crash site, the missing parachute, and then, impossibly, confirmation began to trickle in. Locals had reported a burning bomber falling from the sky. Wreckage matched his serial number. No other parachutes had been found near his landing site. The officer returned one evening, holding a small folder. "It appears," he said stiffly, "that your story is not impossible." Nicholas almost laughed. "Glad you think so." They no longer treated him as a spy after that. Instead, he was sent to Stalag Luft III, the same camp famous for the Great Escape. When word of his story spread among the Allied prisoners, he became a legend, the man who fell from heaven and lived. Even the German guards were fascinated. When the war ended and he was liberated in 1945, Nicholas Alkemade was debriefed by the RAF. They examined him, interviewed him, and confirmed every word. His fall had been slowed by a combination of fir trees and deep snow, a 1 in a billion chance. He was later awarded a certificate for surviving without parachute from 18,000 feet. Years later, when asked how it felt to fall to certain death and live, Nicholas simply said, "It was the easiest way down. There was no alternative." And so the young tail gunner who once chose the sky over fire became something more than a survivor. He became proof that even in a world consumed by war, life sometimes refused to obey the odds.